In order to come to a right understanding and a right interpretive model of any ancient text, we've got to try to get back to what it is actually saying. If you're starting with the conclusion that this is the inspired word of God and it's like the basic instructions before leaving Earth, right, the Bible, you can't pick up the Old Testament, understand it in its context, and then apply it and create an ethical system that will work today. Don't do that. We come to the text believing it to be a tool to create an ethical system, yet we have our own ethical system, our own morality that we've developed over the past 2,500 years. Let's not try to whitewash it and say that it's something that it's not. Let's understand it in its ancient Near Eastern context and then say, okay, well, this was bad from our perspective, but from their perspective, what's the moral of the story?
Welcome to Gnostic Informant, and today my special guest, Digital Hammurabi, Dr. Josh Bowen. One half of Digital Hammurabi, I should say, right?
Not the cool half, but one half.
Yeah, I learned a lot from both of you watching your channel. It's a really good resource to have when you're a history nerd like me, to be able to go to experts in certain fields. And for you consider yourself an Assyriologist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to get into is Mesopotamian religion, how they sort of influence the Old Testament, or maybe even some of the. Let's start off with Daniel first of all.
Okay.
So in the book of Daniel, you'll hear Christian apologists, pastors, and they mean well, and this is their faith. I'm not trying to knock them or anything, but you'll hear them say, oh, well, Daniel was written way before Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
And it calls all these prophecies, and all of them happened, and they're so specific. They're not even just that the city will fall, but they literally told you that there will be 4 kings and all that. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, with any book like that, with any writing like that in the ancient world, we first of all, what you want to do is, before, if you're a Christian apologist or you're a pastor or something, I mean, the first thing that you want to do is just go read a lot, right? Go read what a bunch of scholars are saying about the book of Daniel. And the reason that you want to do that is you'll find out very quickly that it's not quite so straightforward, right? And sort of my motto is always, if you think it's simple, you probably don't understand it. And that's the reality here. And it's not a knock on anybody. It's just the case. Some of these things are very complex. So yes, if you read through the book of Daniel, there's no question you'll walk away from it thinking, okay, so there's a guy named Daniel. He was, among the captives that Nebuchadnezzar II brought back, and he rose up high in the court. I mean, in the royal court, and he wrote about these visions and these prophecies. So, I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. So then, when you start reading about what scholars say about this, there are couple of things that stick out like a sore thumb with the book of Daniel. And I would recommend, by the way, a young scholar, recent PhD graduate who just wrote his dissertation on this, Dr. Jim Majors, if you know Jim. Brilliant guy, super nice also. But he wrote on Daniel. So like he's somebody that could really go into this ad nauseum, he would probably say. But one of the biggest problems that stands out with the book of Daniel is the way that the historical events are presented. So in short, historical events that come from the time that Daniel was supposed to be alive, they're very general, kind of vague, often wrong. Right? Like he gets some stuff wrong, some stuff that you would think, why would you get that wrong? For example, that Nebuchadnezzar is Belshazzar's father, right? Or that Darius the Mede took over the Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's like,
he wasn't a Mede, was he?
Darius, but there was no Darius that took it over, right? It's Cyrus, yeah. But the thing is, like, again, if you just do a cursory, and you don't have to go to liberal scholars. You know, you could go to people like John Goldingay. Even if you go to people like Tremper Longman III, Tremper Longman is going to tell you what the problems are.
Right.
He's going to end up saying, well, I think I think still an early dating of Daniel is right, but at least he'll tell you what the problems are. And so the time that Daniel's supposed to be there alive and functioning, he gets odd things wrong and things are pretty general. But then the time that he's supposed to be prophesying about the end of, the final kingdom here on this earth before God's kingdom comes, well, stuff gets really specific. I mean, much more specific and very accurate, right? So instead of it saying like, there will be a kingdom that will arise, right? It says the king of the north will invade the king of the south. And when that happens, so, this woman will marry this other guy and they'll have an alliance for a short period of time, but then that alliance will fall apart and several people in her family will die. I mean, it's like, really specific.
Very specific. Exactly.
Yeah. And the example that I give when I talk about this to sort of parallel it is if we picked up a document that said the prophecy of Thomas Jefferson, right? And we read it and it said in sort of cryptic language, the brother will rise up against brother and the North will fight against the South, but ultimately, the South will overcome. And then after this, the great foe from the East will be fought against in the Great Revolution, right?
Right.
You would look at that and you go, wait, there's some details about the Civil War wrong.
Right.
And he got them out of order. How do you get the Civil War and the Revolutionary War out of order?
And on top of that, it would also be like that same person getting the presidents wrong leading up to the Civil War.
Yes.
Like 20
exactly
years before, they got a couple wrong. And then all of a sudden, now we're in the Civil War. Now we're specific. Now we're on point. It almost suggests, and correct me if I'm wrong, it almost suggests the time period that it's written in for how on point it is for certain times and how wrong it is for other times.
That's exactly right. And I apologize. My 3-year-old has just decided to
that's awesome.
Photobomb.
Hey, buddy.
Can you say hi? Oh, are you just coming to say goodnight?
You're famous.
Hi.
You're famous now. This is the biggest channel you'll ever be on.
All right, come on. You got to go upstairs. I love you. I love you so much. Sorry.
You kid.
So the example that I give in that, like, can you close those doors, buddy? No, he won't. Of course not. What am I thinking? It's 3. Is that if then the prophecy continued and during the presidential race where the man of the tower fought, against the former senator, and the man of the tower with no prior political experience went to this rally and this sort of thing happened, but it's still in this cryptic language, you'd go, wait a minute, like, hold on. As you were saying, man, the details much later after he's dead and buried,
right?
They're all crazy specific and all correct, right?
And that would almost say, do we even have free choice, free will at that point? If everything's so perfectly predicted, one person who knows scripture, another could have just got right in the middle and say, "Oh, this is going to happen. Let's stop it from happening."
Yeah, there are lots of things that sort of come in, but if you just take a step back, like we would today if we found that document, and we'd say, "Oh, okay, so the time that he's alive, he's getting shit wrong, but the time, hundreds of years later, he's getting lots and lots and lots of detailed accounts correct."
Right.
Probably wrote it here, right? Not back here. And so that's what we see in the book of Daniel. We see earlier things when Daniel's supposed to be alive, he gets them wrong. They're very general, but things that happen much later during the period of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, things get really, really specific. And what is another sort of point that allows scholars to date this with some precision, I think, is that there's a part in Daniel chapter 11 between like verses 35 and 40 where he actually, we think, makes a genuine prophetic prediction, and it's all wrong, right? It's just
Wow.
none of it's right.
So they did
And
actually roll the dice and say, this might happen.
right,
Let's bank on it.
but it makes
That's very
sense.
interesting.
It
Yeah.
makes sense with the point of the text, right? Because it's an apocalyptic text. This is
Yes.
apocalyptic literature.
Yes.
So you can't, if the apocalyptic text that you're writing is supposed to be giving confidence to all the believers to not fall away from the faith,
Right.
well, you can't have it like, the text ends with, and look, there's Jesus. All right, we don't have to worry anymore, right? Like like God's come back. Look up, there it is. No, it has to end with just a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And that's when God's going to come back. And it's going to be bad between now and then, but just have faith, right? Hold on, and God's going to come back.
Right.
Because that's the only way that it works.
That's the way it's been stringing along for centuries, and even till today.
That's right. And that's why we see in the first, like in the first millennium, early centuries, places like Second Esdras, where they sort of reinterpret Daniel. And Daniel wasn't really given all the information. He thought the final kingdom was Greece, but God didn't reveal everything to him, and so it's actually Rome. Well, of course you would say that, because Greece has come and gone. Now there's Rome, right? So,
right.
this one isn't tough. But yeah, that's the situation that we find ourselves in with Daniel.
Yeah, it's interesting because for one, if it's divinely inspired, then there couldn't be anything wrong. So it's like, okay, then we can jump back a notch and say, well, it's human. The human wrote it, but he still got all these prophecies right about the future, and that's when you kind of step in and say, well, this is probably a later dating. Yeah. I mean, we've been told this, and it's sort of been passed down from generation, and it just was accepted, and nobody really challenged it until the last couple hundred years.
Yeah.
So you got to realize that.
And that's the other big thing that I point out in the book that I think is, if you're going into a discussion about this or a debate or something, Christian apologists want to make a big deal out of, all right, there's 4 kingdoms, and the Medes and the Persians are presented as one kingdom together. And so then you end up having, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire together, then the Greeks. Well, then Rome has to be the 4th kingdom. The problem with that is just read the text. Every vision, right? 7, 8, 9, 10 to 12, they all end with Greece. All of them. Some of them say it very specifically, like
right,
the Prince of Greece, right?
Yes.
So if they're all ending with Greece, and they're all ending specifically with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, like the kingdom of God is supposed to come right after Greece.
Right.
Greece is supposed to be the last one.
Right.
So, I mean, you can't get around that.
A day is like 1,000 years. No, it's kidding.
Yeah, right. but that's what you have to do, right?
You have to reinterpret it. Right.
And you have to say things like Second Esdras does, right? Well, it's just, sure, it's said Greece, but that was because Daniel wasn't given the full revelation. We have progressive revelation. You see, progressive revelation. So, it was actually Rome. So but that's what you end up having to do, because as it stands.
And I'm fascinated by looking at the reoccurrence of this Messiah theme in the Old Testament, where you got King Cyrus. He's told by the Jews, you're the Messiah, you're saving us from the evil Egyptian dynasty or whatever it was. And then you got Alexander, and this is even written in the Alexander romance, where the Jews go out and meet him, and he loves them for some reason. He just, oh yeah, I love the Jews, and don't worry, I won't sack you guys. Just, oh yeah, we have this prophecy. It's written by Daniel before you even came, and it's all about
right.
And then it happens again with Vespasian. Vespasian conquers Judea, and then he meets with the high priest Johanan. This is in the Talmud, by the way. In the Talmud, it says the high priest Johanan meets Vespasian and says, "Oh, these prophecies are all about you." And it's like, you're almost thinking like, is this a form of like propaganda for like trying not to get killed in a war? I mean, that could make sense a little bit,
Yeah, I mean, of course. Yeah, I mean, so with something like Josephus, who's writing about Alexander coming to view the book of Daniel. He's not like some unbiased reporter who has no dog in the fight.
Right.
He's he's definitely trying to bolster his own claims. And I'm not a Josephus, like expert at all. So I'm sure you've obviously had lots of people on that are far more well versed in talking about Josephus. But yeah, I mean, these types of things. This is how, when you have prophetic texts like this, part of the reason that apocalyptic literature can do what it does and be as versatile as it is because they often don't use specific names, right? Now they sometimes they slip, and we have to really hone in on those things. But a lot of times they're written in this sort of vague, cryptic language, which then allows a later writer to, I mean, we see this in the biblical text itself, right? So, Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 25, right, 70 years, right? Well, then the writer of the book of Daniel, noticing that why are we still not the main world power? What's going on here? And now we're suffering persecution under the Antiochus. Well, what's the dealio, right? And so then what he does is, or what they do is look back and reinterpret an earlier text. So Daniel chapter 9 opens up with Daniel going, I'm reading in the book of Jeremiah and probably Leviticus 26 as well, and saying, well, gosh, and Leviticus 25, but probably Leviticus 26, and saying, oh my gosh, like 70 years, well, God's going to punish us 7 times more for our sins. 70 times 7 is 490. That makes this work a little bit better, right? So it's reinterpreting the text. Intertextuality is going on. So yeah, that sort of stuff I think is at play, and apocalyptic literature lets you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense what you just said. How much do you think ancient polytheistic religions of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian, how much do you think they influenced monotheistic religions that came later, like the Old Testament, for example?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question.
Yeah.
I would say, like, the short answer would be greatly. Uh, um, and I would say that in a lot of ways, the Hebrew Bible is polemicizing, is reacting to the mythology, the religious practices that it sees. And before I talk about that, maybe a good thing to do would be to talk about how it's just done more generally in the ancient Near East. And there's a really good example of this. There's a text called the Enuma Elish, which I'm sure you know all about.
The creation
but
story?
just in case, yeah.
Yeah.
And just in case people watching don't know, it's about it's a text that was probably written at the end of the second millennium BCE in Akkadian, and it's the story of the ascendancy of Marduk, the god Marduk, over a Babylonian god. And it ends up, they call it a creation story because what he does after defeating Tiamat, the main antagonist, he creates heaven and earth, and organizes the cosmos and all these things. Okay, well, this text was recited every year at the New Year's festival in Babylonia. It was called the Akitu Festival. And it was such a big deal that when the Neo-Assyrian kings, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire was in power, the Neo-Assyrian king would actually come down to Babylonia, and Babylonia was their vassal, but they would come down and they would present themselves to the Marduk priesthood, take off their royal vestments. The priest would actually end up like slapping the king. Wow. I mean, it was a big deal, right?
It's almost what happened with the Pope later on with the Holy Roman Empire.
Interesting. Yeah. That's probably not a bad parallel. Not like a late historian. But yes, I think that's probably a good parallel. But that's how important the South and its traditions and its liturgies and its mythology were to everybody in Mesopotamia. Well, what we see is that at some point it's debated how this happened, but we end up seeing an Assyrian under the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an Assyrian version of this Enuma Elish. And what's interesting about it is that the story stays essentially the same. Like the very beginning, because there's a slight problem with genealogies, they change a couple of things, very small things. But essentially all they do is go through and pull Marduk's name out and put Asher,
Is that
their
what happened
god.
with Ishtar and Inanna? Are they the same deity? Or is that
They are, it's different. Ishtar would be like the Akkadian version of
gotcha?
the Sumerian deity Inanna.
Gotcha.
But this was a very deliberate attempt to take this mythological text that was incredibly important, that everybody knew, that was foundational to
Right.
the annual cycle, and to strip Marduk from it and replace it with Asher, their deity.
Wow.
And you might think, well, why the hell would they do that? I mean, like, if I've got a buddy that has said that that has a story about his grandfather who fought at Iwo Jima or something. I mean, what good would it do for me to take his story and say, well, not his grandfather, my grandfather, and just put his name in?
That is strange.
But that's looking at it through 21st century eyes, right? To them, simply having the name, simply having the story about that deity, by simply replacing one God's name for another, imbued it with power, right? And it made it a type of reality.
Wow.
Right. And so, and it's obviously more complex than that, but
no, but what you're saying is so deep and important, because this is that scepter that they talk about, that power, that scepter that's yielded. Is these myths, these religions are very powerful. They're the most effective way of propaganda is getting people to believe in some sort of spiritual path that they will align themselves with. They'll go to war over it. They'll do whatever they have to do to progress that idea. So that's right. That's what we're dealing with.
And what's interesting, the reason that I bring all of that up, besides the fact that I think it's just hella cool, is when you think about that, you've got two Akkadian texts and two cultures, Mesopotamian cultures, north and the south, and one is utilizing that story, right, for its own purposes. So when you come to the Hebrew Bible and you see something like the flood story, and we don't have to go into all the details about this, if people are interested, David Carr, Carr, recently wrote a book called, I think it's The Formation of Genesis 1 through 11. Phenomenal read, brilliant scholar. But he talks about a lot of these like non-biblical precursors to these parts of the primeval history. But if you look at the flood story in Genesis 6 through 11, one of the things that you notice is that not only does it pull from the like Atrahasis, what we see in Gilgamesh Tablet 11.
Yeah, there's that character in Gilgamesh who the god Ea, I think, tells him to make an ark, and he survives a flood, and then he's like talking about it.
And there's all kinds of details that surround this that are parallel. But just so everybody, I guess maybe just so everybody knows, in the early second millennium, like the first half of the second millennium, a text was written, a literary text called Atrahasis. And Atrahasis is the name of the flood survivor. And so the people start, gods create humanity to do the work for the gods, which, think about Genesis and the Garden of Eden.
Right.
I mean, this isn't terribly difficult to reconcile.
Yeah.
But so that humanity starts to overpopulate, they become really noisy, and now Enlil can't sleep. And so he decides, I got to wipe all these people out, right? So he sends like a plague, and then he sends, sends several different things to decimate human population. And Ea, the god that you're talking about, tries to save humanity, and does. He succeeds, and he tells people how to escape from the things that Enlil is sending. Well, finally, Enlil gets fed up with it. And he says, all right, I know somebody's helping him. I don't know who. So all you gods swear that you won't help humanity when I do my next thing. And they all swear. So he says, all right, I'm going to send a flood. So Ea goes down to Atrahasis, and he stands next to this reed fence. And Atrahasis is standing next to the reed fence, and he says, reed fence, there's flood coming. Right? Build a boat, reed fence. Right? So he's not telling Atrahasis.
Wow, that's fascinating.
He's telling this reed fence.
Uh,
So the same sort of story happens, right? They build this boat, bring on animals to keep things going. The gods send this flood. They float around on top for a while. When it comes to land, sending out the raven and all this stuff, and then offer a sacrifice at the end when they get off. So you can see the story is like eerily similar.
yeah.
And
another thing I noticed too is in the Enuma Elish, I think it's the Enuma Elish, correct me if I'm wrong, but they talk about in the beginning it was just primordial waters,
That's
Apsu
right.
and Tiamat.
Yep.
But in the Genesis, in the Old Testament, they don't say Apsu and Tiamat, but it does say the primordial waters is the only thing there was.
And it says Tehom, and if you the Hebrew word for the deep, which is cognate with Tiamat.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So if you just think about
that's why I had to have you on, dude, to learn stuff like this.
Yeah. Like these are things that of course, and if you're not, if you don't read it in the Hebrew, it's sort of hard to know that stuff. But Tehom, Tiamat, it's just they're cognates. And so what's happening? Not with just to sort of tie that together, I guess. What's happening? Actually, maybe I should say it this way. Let me tell one more story.
Yes.
One more story.
Please do.
So there is a story from the early second millennium called the Anzu myth. And the Anzu myth is the story about this Anzu bird, this ferocious divine bird. And he steals this thing called the Tablet of Destinies. And it's this tablet that whoever holds it controls reality, right? And he flies off into the mountains, and the gods all fall apart, and certain people are asked to go out and fight against Anzu to get it back, and they all come back too scared. And finally this god Ninurta is convinced to go out, right? So he goes out, they have this fierce battle, he loses, and so he gets advice from Ea, again same deity, and Ea says, here's how you do it. We're going to trick Anzu for you to win. So what he does is they're fighting. The trick is that as they fight, Anzu gets tired and lowers his wings. Well, Ea tells him when he does that, take and cut off the pinions, his long feathers, off his wings. And what he'll do is he'll take the Tablet of Destinies and he'll say, feathers, return to me. Because everybody wants their pinions back, right? And when he does, when he says, feathers, return to me, take an arrow and shoot it. And the fletching that's made of feathers on the arrow will also be drawn to him, and it'll kill him, right?
Wow.
Okay, so the reason that I told you that story is, again, it's just not only because it's really cool.
It's super fascinating story.
The Enuma Elish, Marduk is the new Ninurta. Very intentionally is the new Ninurta.
Right.
So, for example, and there are parallel things that you can see. One of them is like incredibly clear. There's a line in the Anzu myth where it says, let the feathers of Anzu blow back to the gods to declare, your victory over Anzu.
Right.
Well, there's something called a blind motif when you're thinking about how two texts interact with each other. And the blind motif is when text B is borrowing something from text A, but when they borrow it in, it doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't fit the context.
Yes.
But they're doing it to try to make a very direct connection between the two texts. So one of the blind motifs that shows up in Enuma Elish is when Marduk kills Tiamat, he cuts open her veins and the blood runs out. And it says, let the blood blow in the wind back to the gods.
Instead of the feathers, it's the blood.
Right, but blood doesn't blow in the wind, right?
So I see what you're saying. Now that's the blind motif.
That's right. That's the thing that doesn't make sense, but it's very clear.
It was written for the feathers, but they switched to blood, and now you can see that.
And now you can see that it doesn't make sense. That's exactly right. And there are a couple of those. That's like Marduk uses a net. That's Ninorta's weapon is a net, right? When Marduk uses a net, he's using it against Tiamat, which is the water deity. Like it doesn't really work. Anyway,
I see what you're saying.
So there's a direct connection between those two texts. But the thing that we want to camp on, and this will bring me back to Genesis, and I'm sorry I'm being so long-winded.
Oh no, this is great.
The thing that you want to pay attention to when you see two texts that are interacting with one another and a later one that's sort of reusing something or doing something, you want to pay attention to where they're different. Those are the key points. So in the Enuma Elish, if you think back to the Anzu myth, Ninorta had to be convinced to go out and fight, and he had to actually fight the guy with the Tablet of Destinies, and he lost, and he had to win through trickery. Marduk volunteers to go. Wow. He's going to go fight Tiamat. She creates like a consort. Tiamat creates a consort named Kingu. And Kingu, she gives him the Tablet of Destinies. Well, if you read the story, Marduk approaches the battle. He's not even in the battle. He's just approaching, and Kingu falls out. He's done, defeated. Just by his approach, he's defeated. So the reader who knows the Anzu myth goes, my God, Ninorta, this amazing deity, this crazy powerful deity. I mean, he had to fight and fight and fight, and then ultimately had to trick. Marduk must be super, super powerful because just by approach, he doesn't even have to fight. So those are the things that we need to pay attention to, is where do they differ? Where are they reworking things? And so, okay, bringing it back to Genesis and the flood story. If you think about what Genesis or what Atrahasis does and what you see in the Gilgamesh epic, when Enlil sends the flood to decimate humanity or to kill humanity, it's because they're being really noisy and overpopulating and he can't sleep. And in the text, he's actually said to be evil for having done this evil thing that you did.
Right.
Well, if you think about Genesis 6, why does Yahweh send the flood? It's not because of overpopulation. It's not because it's because the people are evil.
Right.
And the text goes to great lengths to talk about that. Every thought of the imagination of their heart was only wicked continually. I mean, it's like,
right.
And so what it's doing is the text is saying, no, it's not Enlil that sent it. It's Yahweh that sent the flood. And Enlil did it as a dick, right? Sent it being evil, but Yahweh did it, not only justified in doing so, but absolutely had to do it because of how wicked humanity was. Right. So it's reutilizing, it's reworking the text to do something new as a polemic in many cases against these older traditions.
Now that brings us to a whole nother discussion that I think we should touch on, is morality.
Okay.
So a lot of Christian apologists, a lot of Baptist pastors, and just Christians in general, and not even just Christians, different religions across the board, Muslims too, their big argument that they hang on is that you don't know where morality comes from. It can't just come from somewhere. It has to come from God. And I used to hold on to this all the time. I used to think this was the slam dunk argument against atheists until I started really reading about history and philosophy. When I started learning the evolution of history and philosophy, I noticed that religions evolve with history and philosophy, the times. So the New Testament religion, the turning the other cheek and, to being good to the poor and all that, you see that coming at a time where that's becoming more popular in philosophy. So I think religion, morality and religion comes from us, from our human experiences.
Sure.
And then we write it into religions later on. I don't think it's the other way around.
Oh yeah. No, I agree. And one of the things that I think people miss um, when we think about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, is particularly Christian apologists will say things like, my God, look how amazing the morality of the Old Testament is. I mean, you know, look, you get a day off every week.
Right. The law is so perfect.
Uh, you know, you have to let your slaves worship. You know, my it says here, love your enemy, right? And those are great things. I mean, there's like not the first two. The first two are like,
Right, 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 right.
but the loving your enemy thing, caring for the poor, caring for the orphan, the widow, the oppressed.
Right.
Those are all great things. There's no question. But what people don't realize is they were also the case in the wider ancient Near East. So if you read through like the law code of Hammurabi, just read through the prologue. All you got to do is just read it in English, and you'll see very quick. Sorry, go ahead.
An eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Like the literal phrase that's in
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
Torah is the
yeah.
same exact phrase that's in the code of Hammurabi.
And what? But the thing that people don't get is that if you read just the opening to the law collection of Hammurabi, what you'll see is that Hammurabi is saying, I'm a great king. And here's why I'm a great king. I'm a shepherd of the people. I care for the poor. I care for the oppressed. And I make sure that the rich man doesn't oppress the poor man. And I make sure that, I mean, it's like you read that and you go, well, damn,
Right.
like
You say
this
it like
isn't,
that.
yeah, this isn't like a novel idea. And,
Right.
and you see it everywhere in the ancient Near East. So like this idea um, that a text talking about caring for the poor and caring for the orphan, like I do think that there are certain things, there's no question that there are certain things in the Hebrew Bible that are, I would say, moral developments. They tend to be moral developments for fellow Israelites, right? The fellow Israelites benefit, not everybody.
Right.
But
there's even laws that have to do with how to deal with slaves. If you catch a slave stealing something, they're dead on the spot. But then there's like other that they differ from the citizen, from especially even from male to female. I mean, men get way more rights than females did back then. I mean, how does that? That's one of those things I think about, and I'm like, you can't say it's moral based on where we're at today in the world.
Yeah,
how far the human psyche has progressed. We now push for equality.
Yeah,
and but you got the people who want to hang on to this ancient code.
Yes,
and they think that's moral because it says so.
Yeah,
just because it says so.
And I think that's the thing. I use the example. So I wrote a book on slavery in the Old Testament, and I used the example in there about if 500 years from now, people were to read about in the 1950s, or even maybe for you and me more recently with with our parents, how parents used to beat their kids with paddles or beat their kids with switches. Um, I look at that today and I go, like I can't fathom doing that to my kid. Well, if in 500 years it's like totally taboo, like my God, who would spank their child?
Right.
We have to make sure that we're careful to keep our categories distinct.
Yeah.
So them looking back at us and saying, well, they obviously, like my parents obviously didn't love me. Like Josh's parents didn't love him because they beat him with a paddle, right? Well, that would be completely unfair because culturally it wasn't just allowable; it was expected, right? If you didn't do it, you were a bad parent, right? So in that sense, going back to the ancient Near East and saying those horrible people, look what they did. They're just so immoral. I don't think that's fair.
You make a good point. This is a good point because go ahead, finish your thought. Sorry.
But what I think we can do is say, okay, if we have a timeless, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient being who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, And he, at any point in time, is saying it's cool to own people. That's a problem, in my opinion.
Yes.
Um,
It also
and
shows that this is a man-made thing, a
right,
human-made thing, if you think about it. And
yeah,
and the reason why I bring up that this is a good point that you're making is we can't blame the Bible any more or less than we can blame the time period in which it was written.
yeah, that's right.
Because we were talking about law codes, and I was writing down some notes about the ancient law codes that even predate Hammurabi.
Hmm.
We got what's called the Ur Nammu,
Hmm.
and I wrote down some of the stuff that I thought was crazy in there, just because of some examples. And one of them is the ordeal by water.
Yep.
And they thought that if somebody was accused of stealing, they would throw them off a cliff into the water. If they survived, then they were innocent.
Yep.
God helped them survive that ordeal
Yeah.
because they were innocent. But if
Yep.
they died, they were guilty and they did it.
Yep.
So we got to remember what mind frame people were in back then.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have something very similar to that in Numbers chapter 5, right? That whole, the woman is suspected of having cheated on her husband. And so he takes her to the priest and she drinks this potion, right? This mixture. And the way that they thought about the river ordeal was that the river itself was a deity,
Yes.
right? And so like in comes the person and the God is going to deal with them.
Yes.
And in the same way, by swearing this oath, it's Yahweh is utilizing in a sense, in a very real sense, that potion or that concoction now as it goes into her body. She has brought this curse down upon herself, and he's going to use that to, make her infertile, right, and unable to bear children. And so, but again, it's a very similar act to the river ordeal, because it's like, look, we don't have evidence, like we can't prove it one way or another, so we're gonna essentially kill them all and let God sort them out, right? That's really the mentality. Like we're gonna throw them to the wolves, and if God wants to save them, God will save them if they're innocent. Yeah. So it's, but to go back and to say, this is where I get really frustrated with Christian apologists, because what Christian apologists will do so often with things like this is they will say, okay, God is like working with the people. He's condescending to the people. And you can't judge the people based on what they did because everybody did this. Well, that's one thing. That's true. That's one category. What did people do back then? But you can't then conflate that and say, well, God's just condescending to them, because these are God's laws.
Right.
So those are two very distinct things.
Yes.
So I think that's where it becomes a slippery slope, where they're equivocating, right, on what we're talking about. So I think the morality thing is actually a really important aspect to this.
Yeah, and that's because it's funny, because if this law was so divinely perfect, then what from a Christian point of view, why would it need to be changed at all? Even if it says I'm here to fulfill the law, but then again, don't worry about these diet laws, and just it's the law is written in your hearts. If it was so perfect and pure, and it was so, that's what the entire Old Testament revolves around, is the law.
Yeah.
I mean, the book of Psalms, every other psalm has the word law in it.
Yeah.
If it's so perfect and divine and pure, then why would it even need to be talked about and touched on by the Messiah? So that was one of the, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, this is why you're starting to see now, at least I am online, more and more Christian apologists reading about ancient Near Eastern law. And one of the things that they see is that Assyriologists and people that work in biblical law are pretty much on the same page with these law collections do not represent legislation, right? They're not like, okay, what's the law? All right, Hammurabi sits down, or has his scribe go through, and write out these 282 laws. Right now, he's promulgating the law. Boom! Now these are the laws of the land. Everybody's pretty much united. That's not what's going on there. So these laws are describing legal reality. And again, that's debated to what degree that's true, whatever. But what they say is they're not prescriptive in the sense that no judge, they don't think, any judge is, you come to me and you say, hey, my buddy has an ox and he gored my slave. What are we going to do about this? And he goes, judge says, all right, hang on a second. Just check out the Steely here. Okay. Okay. So what the law says is like, that's not what's going on.
Right.
But why that matters is that now Christian apologists are starting to say, well, now, wait a minute, if the law collections aren't prescriptive, then maybe what's going on in the Hebrew Bible is that these are man-made laws that aren't meant to be prescriptive. They're meant to be like wisdom texts. They're meant to be like, general practices. And so now, well, you bring up a slavery law. Well, that's not prescriptive. That's descriptive. And it's, it's describing what they were doing, but it's not really God's perfect law. Well,
and this is what Philo would talk about in his writings. Philo would allegorize everything, even like diet laws, he would allegorize.
Yeah. But the problem with this is that it's, in my opinion, it's inescapable. You can't look at Leviticus 25 and say, all right, those slave laws are just descriptive. They're not, meant to be. No, it says God speaking in the first couple of verses and saying, here's what you're going to tell them to do.
Yes. I mean, as good as a writer as Philo was, he really was stretching and trying to make things work in a new time period. In the Hellenistic period, he has these laws that the Greeks don't like, and he's trying to push it on them, and he has to figure out a way. And the best way was to allegorize it. And like you said, ultimately, all you're doing is you're stretching reality into the way you want it to be.
As you said in the beginning, to your moral sensibility that you have, right? You recognize this is what we do today, right? I mean, you can see Christian apologists doing it all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we know slavery is wrong. All right, so this really can't be saying that slavery is okay. So what do we do with this, right? Well, the underlying principle, right? The reason that you're doing that is because slavery's wrong. Like, that's where you're at.
Right.
Whereas if it was, 300 years ago, this would not be an issue for you. So, I think this is really the, so if in 500 years we realize that, like it's Futurama or something, and the animals can talk to us, and they've been saying, actually, we've been feeling this, horrible psychological pain watching, all of our relatives be slaughtered or something. And we look back at this and go, my God, how could we eat animals? Right. You wouldn't be able to then turn back to the sacrificial system, and go, well, it wasn't really killing animals. What it was doing, right? But that's what you'd have to do, right? And so I think that's why this is important to distinguish between the biblical values as they're presented in the text and the biblical values that we bring to the text, and draw things out of their context in order to solidify what we believe to be right already.
Yeah, you explained that perfectly. That's exactly what I was trying to get at, is that we are the ones that make up we decide what's moral, what's good, and what's based on our experiences. Like, if I go around stealing stuff, people are going to say, hey, you're stealing from me. And someone might punch me in the face. Now I have experience of what happens if I steal. I remember that, and I pass that along. That's what morality comes from. It comes from life experience.
Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about the deities. You hear all this time that Yahweh was one of a big pantheon of gods. So was El, was like the chief deity. Mm-hmm. What's true about that, and what's not true?
So that's a very specific area of study in studies of the Hebrew Bible. So I'll do my best. Mark Smith has written on this fairly extensively. I don't agree with everything Mark Smith says, but I mean, he's obviously incredibly knowledgeable on the topic. But lots of people have written about this. So okay, there are two questions that we have to ask. And actually, there's a really good book that was just published last year by an old professor of mine, Ted Lewis, and it's called The Origin and Character of God.
Hmm.
And it's a 1,000-page book. I mean, it's meaty, but it's excellent. It's on Israelite religion, ancient Israelite religion. Okay, so there are two things that we have to distinguish. We have to distinguish between Israelite religion and religion in the Hebrew Bible. Those are two very different things. Sometimes they overlap, a lot of times they don't, right?
Gotcha.
And people, I think, miss that. So when people talk about, oh, foreigners would want to be captured by the Israelites because they worship one God and they love a, what are you talking about? Like, that's you can't just read the Hebrew Bible and say this is what people did. Like, that's not how this works.
Right.
Okay, so there are certain things that I think are unproblematic when it comes to Israelite religion. For example, there's polytheism, right? You have Yahweh worship, but Yahweh's got Asherah. You know, obviously the Israelites are also worshiping Baal. I mean, these things are
Even one of the 12 tribes, Asherah. Asher. It sounds like the god.
Asher, yeah.
There's a god named. I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong about this. I'm pretty sure there was a god named Gad who was a god of luck in Canaanite religion, something like that.
I'd have to look into that. I haven't looked into that.
I could be wrong.
We all could.
Yes.
So, but what I think in the Hebrew Bible is happening is in this context, you always hear things like, Genesis 1, let us make man in our own image, right? What's that talking about? The divine counsel, right? People want to see the Trinity there. Mismouth that shit. So sorry. So Deuteronomy 32 is a place where it turns quite often, right? Where God is dividing up the nations and giving different divine beings the nations as an inheritance, and Yahweh is given Israel, and there's a distinction that you can see that I think that the writer is trying to smooth out.
I was just going to say, it's almost like you see these little remnants of the polytheistic world creeping its way into the text. And I think a big example of that is Job, where in the book of Job, it says the sons of El lined themselves up in front of, at the court or whatever it says. And it's like, then the accuser comes in and he's like the district attorney. And he's like, it's like really strange how it's written.
Yeah. And I think what's happening here is that in places like Deuteronomy 32, I mean, what's a good analogy for this? Well, David's probably a good analogy. So Joel Baden talks about David in his book on, I think it's Biography of David. I'm not sure. I can't remember the title. Never remember titles. But he talks about how, the stories that you read about David are like spin central, right? So if you think about how if I told you a story about a store owner in New York City, and these two gentlemen come walking into his store and kind of lean up against his storefront window and say, "Man, it's a really nice storefront window you got there. My team has been protecting this storefront window for the past month for you, and we know you didn't ask us to do that, but we would hate for something to happen to this storefront window, so we've been protecting it for you. And you know what? We're only going to charge you $10,000 for having done that. What a deal, huh? Right? Like you would say, mob, right? And poor store owner, he's being they're shaking him down for money, extortion, yeah. Well, if the mob were writing that story, they might say something like, and so Jim Bob Mobster, he and his team of 10 friends that were highly trained to, insecurity, boy, they really, they looked after that storefront, and there were people that came up and they shooed them away because they really wanted to make sure that that store owner had his storefront and could continue to operate. And then after a month's time, they sent two representatives into the store and said, "My good man, we have been laboring hard for you, and would you be able to provide us with some, And the evil store clerk said, "I'm not gonna pay you a dime." Right? Okay,
Right.
that's what you see with David, right? You've got a guy named Naval, and the same thing happens. We've been guarding your sheep. We've been watching after your flock.
Yeah.
Give us some stuff, but Naval, his name means fool, right? And I mean, like, his own wife is coming out and apologizing for how the lack of gratitude on Naval's part, and how stingy he was. And of course, ultimately, Naval ends up dead, and all of his stuff and his wife are now in David's hands. Well, okay, this is early apologetics, right? This is an apologia.
Yes.
This is spin. This is trying to take a story. But the reason that I bring that up, and Joel Baden said this, I think, very eloquently, you don't spin things that you don't need to spin.
Right.
So he looks at this and says, I think that there was a guy named David, and something similar to this happened. Right. And it had to be spun because people knew about this story, and people, like, you don't spin stuff.
Well, it's like some propaganda being slid in there.
That's right.
Right.
Well, now that I've told that story, I don't remember what the analogy was for.
We were talking about polytheism.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So I think what's happening here is the writer holds to monotheism, right? Or at least henotheism of some sort. But I think it's moving toward monotheism at least. And of course, that's debated about when that happened, whatever. But I think that the writer is moving towards this at a minimum. And so what he's doing is spinning in Deuteronomy 32. So everybody knows about these deities. Everybody knows about Israelite worship, right? So, but how do we do this apologetic where we recognize the diversity, but spin it in such a way that it shows that it's actually the same deity? El and Yahweh are actually the same deity. And I think we see this in the patriarchal narrative, right?
Yes.
Same deity as El Shaddai, right? And Yahweh. And so it's just in different titles. That's right.
Being thrown around, but
that's right.
Especially once you get it rendered in English, it's done. It's the Lord.
Yeah.
And you'll never know the difference unless you actually learn Hebrew.
Yeah, that's right.
So like a lot of these Christians today in America are divine, or have the ignorance of the bliss of ignorance. So they don't even have to realize that the person's name was fool in Hebrew. If they knew that, they might change their thought on the story a little bit. Like, oh, it sounds like it's mythologized a little bit.
Right.
You know what I mean?
We're doing something here.
Right. And that's what's fascinating about over time, people actually get more dogmatic, and it becomes more of real history than actually think that. I think people that are actually told the story weren't even trying to put it out that way. I think they were letting, like, oh yeah, this is true, but it's also, divinely inspired and mythologized a little bit. Then you get examples like, I don't know how much you know about this, but the book of Esther, where the names sound like Mesopotamian gods. Like Mordecai sounds like Marduk.
Yeah.
And there's a god named Hamon, and the character's name is Hamon, literally word for word. I don't know what's going on.
I haven't looked into that. And actually that came up again recently.
It's definitely
I've got to buckle down and I guess I've got a couple of things going on that's keeping me from doing that, but
I'm gonna be interested to hear what you come up with if you actually look into that, because that's a fascinating thing. Because it looks pretty clear, like the names are kind of, but it could be coincidence. I don't know. I'm not an expert.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
But yeah, man. Oh, I think it's been just about an hour, and
oh wow.
I just want to let everyone know that his book is out there. An Atheist Handbook for the Old Testament. Phenomenal book, thorough and easy to read too. Very easy to read.
I appreciate that.
Great book. Yeah. And it's available on, there it is right there. There's the title.
There it is.
It's available on Amazon. It's also, it has a hard copy like you just saw. You can also get it on Kindle and audiobooks. And who's the narrator?
Somebody named Seth Andrews. I don't know.
Just something.
Yeah.
Something.
It was between Seth Andrews and Donald Trump. And, I think I made the right choice.
Yeah, I think you did.
This book is perfect. Okay.
Couldn't be any better. All right. Thanks for coming on. And I will keep in touch and have a good one.
Thanks for having me.